Welcome again to Wednesday night worship. It's great to see all of you back here tonight. We're going to be picking up again and finishing out the fathers of our faith and the fathers of Israel, and be actually going to be looking at Joseph tonight. But before we do that, how many of you have siblings? I think everybody in here almost. How many of you were the favored one? I was not. Not that I was treated badly or unloved or anything of that nature. I just was not the favored sibling. If I've described myself before more as the forgotten child than anything else. I was well behaved. I didn't get in trouble. I took care of myself. Been working since I was 12. I didn't bother my parents all that much and got good grades. And so I was more the forgotten child because I didn't need the attention necessarily. But before my youngest brother came along, my sister was the favorite child because she was the only girl and the baby. And I remember distinctly one time, so we loved the Ninja Turtles, and so my dad had bought us all wooden swords, like legit practice wooden swords from the karate store in the mall, and we all had one. Well, I was playing with a wooden croquet ball one day, and I had that sword in my hand, and I dropped it. Well, my sister wanted it. And I was like, no, I'm playing with it, and I jumped on it to get it back, and she jumped on me. Well, when she jumped on me, her head hit my sword. Now, that's not the story that my father heard. The story my father heard was that I hit her with my sword. And my dad promptly broke the sword over a tree. Now, when he found out the truth, he felt terrible, and he went and bought me a new one. But my sister, we complained to my dad all the time. She got away with so much stuff. She never did any wrong. She was perfect, blah, 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 until my youngest brother came along, and then that was him. He just grew up. My youngest brother grew up very differently than the rest of my family did. But that's a whole nother story. It's just one of those things that there's always that favored child. Parents always say that's not the case, that's not true, but you know it is. There's always one that's like, yeah, they're my favorite. And tonight we're going to be looking at Joseph, and Joseph was clearly the favored child. And so we're going to read Genesis 37, 1 to 11 to start things off looking at this passage. This is where we start getting to hear about Joseph, and then we'll pray and we'll move on. Let's read those. Starting Genesis chapter 37, verse 1 through 11. And it says, "Now Jacob lived in the land where his father had sojourned, in the land of Canaan. And these are the records of the generations of Jacob. Joseph was 17 years of age when pasturing the flock with his brothers while he was still a youth, along with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought back a bad report about them to their father." Yeah, he's not already starting off that great with his brothers. "His brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, and so they hated him and could not speak to him on friendly terms. Then Joseph had a dream, and when he had told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, 'Please listen to this dream which I've had. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf rose up and stood erect, and behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheep.' Then his brothers said to him, 'Are you actually going to reign over us, or are you really going to rule over us?' And so they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Now he had still another dream and related it to his brothers and said, 'Lo, I have had another dream, and behold, the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me.' He related it to his father and to his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him, 'What is this dream that you have had? Shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come to bow ourselves down before you to the ground?' His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind." Let's pray. Heavenly Father, just thank you for this evening again. I just ask your blessing on tonight as we look at your servant Joseph. And God, I just ask that you would speak through me tonight and that you would work in the hearts of those that are here this evening. In your precious Son's name, amen. So as we look at Joseph, this is a little bit different than the guys we've been looking at, right? One of my professors I had in seminary called this the Joseph Chronicles because it's a very large section of Genesis that we get someone that doesn't have a direct impact on the promise that we've been looking at, right? We've been following this promised seed that God had told Adam and Eve about, and then we moved into Abraham with his promise of descendants in this great nation, and then Isaac, and then Jacob, and now all of a sudden we're going off on this side story. Those that play video games, it's a side quest, right? We're going off on this side story that almost doesn't seem to have anything to do with this main plot. But it actually has a huge part to play. One of the things that God had promised Abraham was to make him into a great nation. And there are three basic things that you need to be a nation. The first one is land, and God showed him his land, the land of Canaan. And that's where they were currently living. The second thing you need is people. Well, they finally went from having just a single descendant to 2 to now 12, or at this point only 11, but it's not quite enough people to actually have a nation yet. And then the third thing is the law, and they get that later on. This story that we're going to be looking at with Joseph, this account, is the explanation of how God moves the Israelite people to Egypt, where they can be under the protection of Egypt and just grow, and to get the people that they need to be a nation. And so that's what this whole story is about, as well as God's provision and the fact of how He works things in such a way that they seem negative to some. They can seem like terrible situations, but He's working things in such a way for the benefit of His people, right, as Romans talks about. And so that's what we're going to see as this works out. So a little bit of biographical information. His parents are Jacob and Rachel, his siblings. He eventually has 11 brothers and a sister. His wife is Asenath, daughter of an Egyptian priest. He has 2 sons and dies at the age of 110. Now, as I was looking at the life of Joseph, one of the things that kind of stuck out to me is the fact that it seemed like he was blessed all of the time. And it started making me think that sometimes you see, especially these days, it's so terrible these days, the only thing you see in people's lives a lot of times is the good stuff, especially on social media these days. I reconnected with a friend of mine because they had been posting some pictures. They had been posting some pictures a lot and everything, and I just messaged them, and I was like, hey, I really hope and pray that things are going as well as your pictures say that they are. And what that did is it prompted some other conversation, because things really weren't. They really weren't as good as they say they were. And that's one of the things we're going to start seeing when we look at Joseph's life. One of the things is that we always see that Joseph was this favored person, no matter where he went or what he did. And so the difference, though, is that the fact that though we go through hard times, the difference that can be made is how we respond to those hard times. You can always ask the question, which side of the camp are you going to be on? Are you going to be on you're going to beat yourself up and pout and blame others, or even just plain give up? Or are you going to do the work to the best of your ability in the situation that you're in, continue to be faithful to God, wait on His timing that things are going to work out? Or are we going to even try and look at the bigger picture to see what God's trying to do in this situation? And so those are 2 different ways that you can look at this. And what we're going to see is that Joseph continually did this second part. He continually looked at the situation. He did what he needed to do in whatever situation he was in, and God blessed him because of that. And Joseph remained faithful and continued to do it, and eventually saw the bigger picture, right? And so the other thing that we're going to see is the fact that he really modeled Colossians 3:23 and 24. Whatever you do, do your work heartily as for the Lord rather than for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance. It is the Lord Christ whom you serve. And while Joseph didn't necessarily know who Christ was, he knew who the Lord was, and he continually served him in everything that he did. And so what you're going to see as we look at Joseph's life is 4 different phases of Joseph's life. The first phase that we're going to look at is the fact that he was a favored son. He was a favored son by Israel, by Jacob, simply because of the fact at the time he was the only son by his favorite wife, Rachel. And so he was also the youngest. But a lot of these things, because Jacob showed so much favoritism to Joseph, his brothers really started to hate him for it. And as we saw in verse 2, he really didn't help that sometimes, right? So imagine they're all out in the field watching their flocks, doing what they're supposed to do. Boys are going to be boys. They start doing something silly or something they're not supposed to, and what happens? Their youngest brother runs and tattles on them. Now, that's just, you know how that is. The youngest brother always runs off. My youngest brother did that all the time. It's so frustrating. Always. And get us in trouble. It's like, why would you do that? Like, you're here with us. Like, come on. Watch your brother's back. But that's not what he did. He essentially, as much as we don't like it, he did what was right. He remained faithful to his father. He went and told his dad, hey, look, they did this. Now, we don't know whether or not he was involved in it or was party to it or whatever, but he went and took this bad report back to his father, right? But not only that, Joseph was pampered. I mean, he got a lot of things that were normally probably due more to the actual firstborn than to the baby. The fact that he was given this coat of many colors. Colored cloth at that time was not something that was readily available. It really just came out as to whatever color wool or whatever you used to make it. It wasn't this normal thing like we have today. I don't think anybody has the same color shirt on in here today. That wouldn't have been the case back then. So for him to have this coat of many colors was a sign of stature and privilege. And the fact that he was the only one that had it just made his brothers even more jealous. And so we see this fact that he was this favored son, but still he excelled at doing what was right. While his brothers may have seen it as tattling and stuff, he was speaking the truth. He was telling his dad the truth and not lying, not covering up, not doing all those things. And even when God gave him visions that seemed to put him in a higher position than his brothers, knowing he wasn't stupid, he wasn't, ignorant of the situation, he knew how his brothers felt. God gave him this dream anyway, and he goes and tells his brothers, do you really think his brothers are going to take this well? I mean, it's just going to add fuel to the fire, right? And yet he remains faithful, and he does what he's supposed to, and he tells his family about this dream that he had. And even the second time, his father rebukes him because the sun and the moon bow down as well, representing his father and his mother's. It's like, is that, are we going to even? But Jacob recognizes the fact that this is probably something from God because it says that he doesn't forget it. He keeps it in mind. But he still rebukes his son like this, like that's, you're down here, I'm up here. Like let's keep these roles in the proper order here. So out of this situation that Joseph finds himself in, what are the consequences? Well, the first consequence is the fact that he's almost killed. Now, luckily, one of his brothers has some sense and says, hey, just throw him in the cistern, thinking, you know what, I'll just come back and get him later. Let the boys have their fun and do what they need to do. But the truth is that in their mind and in their heart, they wanted to kill him. Now, this is a bit of an overreaction, obviously. It's the same thing as Cain's reaction to Abel's sacrifice being accepted by God and his not. It's a bit of an overreaction to go and kill your brother over it. And so this whole thing was also just a bit of an overreaction, but it still remained that this is what was happening. And so instead of killing him, they end up selling him into slavery. And so the consequences of his relationship with his brothers, this rough, broken relationship with his brothers, because he was this favored son, is the fact that he gets sold into slavery. And so after he gets sold into slavery, we move into this second phase of Joseph's life, and the fact that he was a favored servant. He gets sold into Potiphar's house. And so here we see that Joseph is put in charge of Potiphar's house because everything that Joseph seems to touch does well. And so Potiphar puts him in charge of his house, and his house starts doing really well. Everything is blessed, and you know, Joseph just is, again, we see that he's working in the midst of the situation that he's in. He's not beating himself up. He's not angry. He's not, we don't see anything where he's seeking revenge on his brothers for doing this to him. He's not trying to find a way to escape this servitude that he's been forced into. He's not complaining to God. He accepts the situation he's in. This is where I'm at. This is what's happening. I'm going to do the best I can do and just be faithful to what God's given me to do. And God blesses him. He finds favor in Potiphar's eyes. He gets put in charge of his house. He gains valuable skills that he'll need later on when he gets put in charge again, right? And so out of this being this favored one, Joseph is apparently a rather good-looking man because he catches the eye of Potiphar's wife. Now again, we see that Joseph remains faithful in following God and doing the right thing because he refuses Potiphar's wife's advances. And at one point, he doesn't just say no, he literally turns from sin and runs away from it. Now, what are the consequences, again, of doing the right thing and being the righteous man that he's supposed to be and following after God and doing what's best? He gets thrown into jail unrighteously. He ends up being hated by his master because his master listens to the lies that his wife tells him. And so now, again, Joseph finds himself in this dark situation of being unjustly thrown in jail. So far, even though he was a favored son, he was hated by his brothers and sold into slavery. Even though he was a favored servant, he was lied about and now thrown into jail. But now he finds himself to be a favored prisoner in this jail. So much so that the jailer puts him in charge of the rest of the prisoners and says, okay, you take care of them. And he excels at even that. He even finds favor with some of the other prisoners as he hears their dreams and he interprets their dreams. One of them being a baker. Although the baker doesn't get a positive interpretation of his dreams, the cupbearer does. And the only thing that Joseph asks of him is, just remember me when you leave. He doesn't say, hey, talk to Pharaoh and see if you can work something out and get me out of here, anything like that. He says, just remember me. But even in his blessing, his being blessed by being in this higher position than the rest of the prisoners and doing well even within the prison, he's forgotten. Even though he does what's right, he's there unjustly, he's forgotten. And he's left there for several years before he finds himself before Pharaoh when the cupbearer finally remembers. The Pharaoh has a couple of dreams, very similar dreams. And the cupbearer goes, you know what? There was this guy. Now I remember. It's like, I don't know how you could forget someone that interpreted your dream and said, hey, you're going to be released from prison in 3 days, and it happens, and you just forget that. But he calls him, and he interprets the dream for Pharaoh, telling Pharaoh that there's going to be 7 years of plenty. And so the consequences of being in this prison and everything that happened here is that he gets forgotten. And so then we move into this fourth phase of Joseph's life, and that is being the favored leader. And so as he's standing before Pharaoh and he interprets these dreams for Pharaoh, telling him that there's going to be 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine, and telling him what he needs to do and how he needs to, store up all of these good things and all this kind of stuff, Pharaoh puts him in charge of the entire country. And it's not just a division. It's not like, okay, you're going to be in charge of all of the food for all of Egypt. He puts him in charge second only to himself. There's one verse that says that no one in Egypt will lift a hand or foot unless you say so. And so he has great authority now. And finally, after all of these hardships and seemingly unjust things that have happened to Joseph, he finds himself in a place where God finally wanted him to be. Because it's in this final position as being this leader, this favored leader, that he can now be in a place where he can provide. Not only help provide leadership and guidance and food for the people of Egypt, but also food for his family. Because the famine that came didn't happen just in Egypt, it extended all the way past Canaan. And so even his family was without food. And so so he found himself now in a position where he could provide food for his family. And when his family showed up, the dreams that he had had as a boy, as a 17-year-old boy, finally came true. And his brothers came and bowed down before him, asking for food. And eventually his father came with them, bowing down before him for food because of the position that he was in. But not only that, he eventually was in a place now where he could protect his family, not only from the famine, but from raiders and other people of the land that they couldn't protect him from, because he was able, with the Pharaoh's blessing, to bring his family into Egypt to give them a place to live, where they could live off of the bounty of the Egyptian land and to be under the protection of Egypt. And God even told Jacob in a dream, do this. I'll bring you out of it. He tells him that in Genesis 42, I think, 43, somewhere in there. But he tells him that he'll bring him out of the land. Now, again, God doesn't operate on our timetable, right? It's not that they were in Egypt for 4 years, 5 years until the famine was done. They were there for 400 years before God brought them out of Egypt. But he stuck to his word and he did what he said he was going to do, and he brought them out of the land of Egypt. And so with that, he was in a place that he was able to bring his family into a place where they could produce the numbers that they needed to be a nation. And so the consequences of him being this favored leader is that God brought him to a place where he was actually able to forgive his brothers. Because when he finally reached this place where he understood that he went through all of these difficulties, all of these hardships, to be in a place where he could help his brothers. And he knew. That's where we get the verses in Genesis 45, 5 through 8. Let's actually read that. And so, chapter 45, verses 5 through 8 says, "Now do not be grieved or angry with yourselves." This is Joseph talking to his brothers. "Because you sold me here. For God sent me here before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God sent me here before you to preserve you, a remnant in the earth, and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Now, therefore, it is not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh and a lord of all his household and ruler over all of the land of Egypt." This foreign slave ended up becoming the ruler of all of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh, only by God's doing. And though it seems unjust and unfair as he lived his life through these different circumstances, it was always God orchestrating these things to get him into a position so that his family would eventually benefit from this. So the nation of Israel would eventually benefit from this. And so he was able to forgive his brothers, although they never really believed him, because even after his father died, they were like, "Dad's dead. He's going to come after us now." But even then, that's where we get Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, that says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about the present result, to preserve many people alive." And that's not just his family, but even all of Egypt and everything else that was going on. And so the consequences outweighed the things that happened. Now, that's not to say that as bad things happen to us that we just forget about them and let them go and all that kind of stuff. Sometimes we need to, and sometimes we're able to deal with those things directly. But one of the things that we need to understand as we come through this is the fact that God brings us through valleys for a reason. He has a plan and a purpose that he brings us through dark seasons, difficult times, all of those kinds of things. As we work our way through those things, he doesn't just drop us there and then let us go just to see what happens. He has a plan and a purpose for those events. And we may not always find it easy to forgive, but God calls us to forgive, especially our brothers and sisters in Christ. Sometimes we get so focused on the details, on the little things, that we forget to kind of step back and see the bigger picture and see how God worked those situations out. There are things in my life that if these negative events hadn't happened, I wouldn't be where I am now. If these negative things hadn't happened, I wouldn't be able to speak into situations that I've been able to speak into. A lot of people have commented on the things that I said at our informational meeting a few weeks ago. I wouldn't have been able to say the things that I said if my parents didn't go through a divorce. Now, does that mean that I wanted my parents to go through it? No, absolutely not. But God uses those things for the benefit of his people, for those that are called according to his purpose. So this week, as we go about our week, think about how God has positioned you, sometimes through difficult circumstances, to best serve him. And if you aren't serving him, think about ways that you can serve him in the places that you currently are, because that's what he's called us to do. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, just thank you for this evening. I just thank you for this time with your brothers and sisters, just for this heartfelt service that we've had this evening. God, we just ask that as we do go through difficult situations, that you make it as clear as possible that you are always there beside us, carrying us through the situations with a plan and a purpose. God, knowing that whatever we're going through may not always be fun and enjoyable, but God, you're moving pieces around so that we can be in the place where we can best serve you with the gifts and talents and circumstances and everything else that we have that you've given to us to best serve you, to bring glory to your name, to help build your kingdom. And so, God, I pray as we go throughout our week that we would find opportunity to do so. In your precious Son's name, amen.